In today's video topic, we are going to talk about a story that many parents silently live through but rarely speak about. It's a story about love, confusion, fear, and the kind of courage that only a family can give. Sometimes, the biggest battles our children face are not outside the house, but deep inside their own hearts. And when that moment comes, a parent has only two choices: turn away, or stand beside them. I still remember the evening when everything began to change. It was a quiet night, the kind of ordinary evening that feels exactly like every other day. My son was sitting across from me at the dinner table, barely touching his food. At first, I thought it was just another teenage mood. Maybe school stress. Maybe something with friends. Parents often believe they know their children better than anyone else. But sometimes, the truth is far more complicated than what we see on the surface. For weeks, I noticed small changes in him. He became quieter. The laughter that once filled our home slowly faded into long silences. He started spending more time alone in his room, staring at his phone, or just sitting there lost in his thoughts. As a parent, you feel these things even before they are spoken. You can sense when something is weighing heavily on your child's heart. One night, I gently knocked on his bedroom door. When he looked up at me, there was something in his eyes I had never seen before: fear mixed with exhaustion. Not the kind of fear that comes from failing an exam or getting into trouble, but the kind that comes from carrying a secret for far too long. That was the moment I realized my son was struggling with something much deeper. Parents always imagine a certain future for their children. We dream about their happiness, their success, and the life they will build. But life has a way of rewriting those expectations. Sometimes our children walk paths we never expected, paths that even they don't fully understand yet. A few days later, my son finally spoke words that had clearly been trapped inside him for a long time. His voice was shaking. He looked at the floor as if the weight of the world was sitting on his shoulders. In that moment, I realized he was struggling with his identity, trying to understand who he truly was in a world that can be very quick to judge. And as he spoke, I could feel the fear in his voice. Not fear of the world outside, but fear of losing the one place he hoped would always be safe: his home. That moment changed everything for both of us. Because when your child opens up about something so personal, something so deeply connected to their identity, the way you respond can shape their entire future. Some parents react with anger. Some react with confusion. And some simply don't know what to say at all. But what happened next in our story was something I never expected. The truth my son shared that night didn't just challenge everything I thought I understood about him, it challenged everything I thought I understood about myself as a parent. And the choice I made in the following days would test our relationship, our trust, and our strength as a family in ways I never imagined. Because standing by your child when the world feels uncertain is not always easy. But sometimes, it becomes the most important decision you will ever make. And what happened after that conversation is something that changed our lives forever. That night, after our conversation ended, the house felt strangely quiet. My son had said what he needed to say, but the silence that followed felt heavier than the words themselves. I could see how much courage it had taken for him to open up about the identity struggles he had been hiding for so long. He looked relieved in some ways, but there was still a deep uncertainty in his eyes, as if he was waiting to see whether the world around him would accept him or slowly push him away. As a parent, that moment stayed with me long after we both went to our rooms. I sat awake for hours thinking about everything he had shared. I replayed his words again and again in my mind. My son wasn't just confused about who he was afraid of what that truth might mean for his life, his friendships, and even his own family. The fear of being misunderstood can be incredibly heavy for someone still discovering their identity. Looking back, the signs had been there for quite some time. There were moments over the past year when he seemed distant, like he was carrying thoughts he didn't know how to explain. Sometimes I would ask if something was wrong, and he would simply say, "I'm fine." But now I understood that those quiet answers were covering up something much bigger. Growing up today can be complicated. Teenagers face pressure from everywhere: school, social media, friends, and the constant feeling that they have to fit into certain expectations. For a young person who is trying to understand their identity, that pressure can feel overwhelming. My son had been trying to figure himself out while also worrying about how the world would react. The next few days felt different between us. Not worse, just different. We both knew that something important had been shared, but neither of us fully knew what the next step should be. Sometimes he would start to say something and then stop halfway, like he was still deciding how much of his truth he was ready to reveal. At school, things weren't getting easier for him either. I could tell by the way he came home each afternoon. The confident smile he used to carry had slowly been replaced by tired eyes and quiet walks to his room. Whatever he was facing outside the house was clearly adding to the confusion already inside him. And as a parent, I started to realize that standing by my son wasn't going to be as simple as saying, "I support you." It meant understanding something I had never fully experienced myself. It meant learning, listening, and sometimes questioning my own assumptions about identity, family, and what unconditional love really looks like. But there was still one thing my son hadn't told me. Something that seemed to be weighing on him even more than the identity struggle he had already shared. And when I finally discovered what he had been hiding, I realized the situation was far more complicated than I had ever imagined. Over the next few weeks, I began to notice that my son was fighting a quiet battle almost every day. Some mornings he would leave the house looking determined, like he had decided to face whatever the world threw at him. Other days, he moved slowly, avoiding eye contact, as if the weight of his identity struggle had followed him out the door before he even reached school. One evening, while we were sitting in the living room, his phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it quickly, and I noticed his expression change. The confidence he had been trying to rebuild disappeared in seconds. He picked up the phone and walked away without saying a word. That small moment told me there was another part of this story he still wasn't ready to share. Later that night, I could hear him talking quietly in his room. His voice sounded tense, almost defensive, like he was trying to explain himself to someone who wasn't willing to listen. It made me wonder how many conversations like that he had been dealing with alone. Identity struggles are hard enough, but facing judgment or misunderstanding from others can make them even more painful. At school, things were clearly becoming more complicated. A teacher had mentioned that he seemed distracted in class. A friend's parent had casually asked if everything was okay with him. Small comments like that started to connect pieces of a puzzle I still didn't fully understand. I realized my son wasn't only trying to understand who he was. He was also trying to figure out who he could trust. Friends, classmates, even family members can react in ways that a young person fears the most. And the more I paid attention, the more I started to sense that someone in his life already knew his secret. Someone whose reaction might have been the reason he had been so afraid to tell the truth in the first place. The tension in our home slowly grew in ways that were hard to explain. My son was trying to move forward, but something from the outside kept pulling him back into doubt. I could see it in the way he checked his phone constantly, in the way he paused before answering simple questions, and in the way his shoulders seemed to carry a weight no teenager should have to carry alone. One afternoon, I noticed him sitting on the front steps after school instead of coming inside right away. He looked lost in thought, staring down at the ground as if he was trying to solve a problem that had no easy answer. When I asked if everything was okay, he forced a small smile and said he was just tired. But that smile didn't reach his eyes. A few days later, the truth started revealing itself in small pieces. I overheard part of a conversation he was having with someone from school. His voice sounded frustrated, almost desperate. He kept saying things like, "You promised you wouldn't tell anyone, and I trusted you." The moment I heard those words, my heart sank. It sounded like the secret he had been protecting about his identity might no longer be a secret. After that day, everything seemed to change faster. My son became quieter again, but this time it felt different. It wasn't just confusion anymore, it was fear. The kind of fear that comes when someone thinks the world might soon see a part of them they are not ready to explain. At school, whispers had already started. He didn't say much about it, but I could sense that something was spreading among his classmates. Rumors can travel quickly, and when they involve someone's personal identity, they can be especially painful. Then one evening, he walked into the house holding his phone with trembling hands. He looked at me with a mix of panic and disbelief and said something I will never forget. Mom, I think everyone knows now. When he said those words, the fear in his voice was impossible to ignore. My first instinct was to calm him down, but I could tell this wasn't just a small rumor spreading through the halls of school. Something much bigger had happened. His hands were shaking as he unlocked his phone and showed me the screen. There, in a group chat filled with students from his school, someone had posted messages about him. Not direct insults, not cruel words, but questions and assumptions about his identity that clearly weren't meant to stay private. Screenshots of conversations, pieces of things he had trusted someone with, were now being talked about by people who had no idea what he had been going through. The moment I saw it, my heart dropped. It felt like someone had taken a deeply personal part of my son's life and turned it into something for others to discuss like gossip. My son sat down across from me, rubbing his hands together nervously. "I didn't want it to happen like this," he said quietly. For months he had been struggling with his identity, trying to understand himself at his own pace. But now that choice had been taken away from him. The next morning, things became even more complicated. When he left for school, I could sense he was preparing himself for something difficult. Walking through those doors meant facing classmates who might be whispering, staring, or asking questions he wasn't ready to answer. But later that afternoon, I received a call from the school. At first, I assumed it was about the rumors spreading among students. But the tone in the staff member's voice told me there was something more serious happening. They explained that several students had already been talking about the situation, and teachers had begun noticing tension in the classrooms. What surprised me the most was when they mentioned another name, someone very close to my son. A friend he had trusted more than anyone. According to what the school had heard, that same friend might have been the person who first shared the private information that was now spreading everywhere. When I hung up the phone, my mind was racing. If that was true, it meant the one person my son had relied on during his identity struggle might have been the same person who exposed his secret. And when my son finally came home that evening, the look on his face told me the day had been far worse than either of us had imagined. When my son walked through the door that evening, he didn't say anything at first. He dropped his backpack near the couch and stood there for a moment like he was gathering the strength to speak. I could see that the day had taken everything out of him. His eyes were tired, but there was also something else in them now, something stronger than fear. We sat down together, and slowly he began to tell me what had happened at school. At first, the whispers had followed him through the hallways just like we expected. Some students stared. Some avoided him. A few tried to ask questions he wasn't ready to answer. But then something unexpected happened during lunch. The friend he had trusted, the one everyone believed had shared his secret, walked straight up to their table. My son said the entire cafeteria seemed to go quiet in that moment. People were watching, waiting to see what would happen next. And then his friend spoke. He admitted that he had been the one who accidentally let the information spread. It hadn't started as gossip, he explained. He had confided in one other person because he didn't know how to support my son and needed advice. But that conversation quickly moved through the school like wildfire. Rumors had grown, details had been twisted, and suddenly something private had become everyone's discussion. But instead of denying it or walking away, his friend stood there in front of everyone and took responsibility. He told the students around them that my son had been going through a difficult identity journey and that no one had the right to judge him or turn his personal struggle into entertainment. My son said that moment changed the atmosphere completely. The whispers didn't disappear instantly, but something shifted. People began to realize that this wasn't just gossip, it was someone's real life. Listening to him tell the story, I felt proud of the strength he had shown. For months he had been carrying fear about his identity, about acceptance, about whether his family would truly stand beside him. And now, even after everything that had happened, he had walked through one of the hardest days of his life and come home stronger. But just when we thought the storm had finally started to calm down, my son looked at me and said something that surprised me. "Mom, today made me realize something." He paused for a moment before continuing. "I've been so scared about who I am, but the real challenge is figuring out who I want to become next." When he said that, I could hear a quiet strength in his voice that hadn't been there before. For so long, my son had been focused on fear of judgment, fear of rejection, and fear of losing the people he loved. But now it sounded like something inside him had shifted. The identity struggle that once felt overwhelming had started to turn into something else, a journey of understanding himself and deciding what kind of person he wanted to be. Over the next few weeks, things slowly began to settle. School wasn't perfect, and there were still moments when my son felt uncomfortable or unsure. Rumors don't disappear overnight, and teenagers can sometimes be quick to talk without thinking about the impact of their words. But something important had changed in the way he carried himself. Instead of hiding, he began showing up each day with a quiet confidence that told the world he wasn't ashamed of who he was. His friendship also took time to heal. The boy who had accidentally shared his secret apologized more than once. Trust doesn't come back instantly, but my son chose something that surprised even me. He chose forgiveness. He told me that holding on to anger would only make the situation heavier than it already was. Watching him make that decision showed me just how much he had grown through this experience. As a parent, I also learned something powerful through this journey. Standing by your child during an identity struggle doesn't mean having all the answers. It means listening when they need to talk, being patient when they are still figuring things out, and reminding them that their home will always be a place of support. Sometimes the most important thing a parent can say is simply, "I'm here for you." Our home slowly returned to its old rhythm. The laughter that had once disappeared started to come back, little by little. Some evenings we talked about school, friends, and the future. Other nights we simply sat together watching television, enjoying the comfort of normal life again. Looking back now, I realize that the hardest moments in our story also became the most meaningful ones. My son's journey with identity taught both of us about courage, understanding, and the power of family support. Because at the end of the day, when a child is trying to discover who they truly are, the one thing that matters most is knowing they are not facing that journey alone. And if there's one lesson this true story leaves behind, it's this: sometimes the greatest act of love a parent can give is simply choosing to stand by their child, no matter what.